Here we go. We are live now on YouTube. Welcome everyone to the second session of the Slavery Archive book Club. Today we are discussing the new book by Jessica Marie Johnson, Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World. We are having this session on Zoom and also on YouTube. Then the entire discussion will be broadcast on YouTube. If you have comments, of course, you can ask them here. And then you can leave your questions here. For those of you who are on Zoom, you can leave your questions, ask your questions on video. If not, if you are on YouTube, you can just put your questions on the chat, and you are going to make our best to answer your questions. My name is Lucia Araujo. I am professor of history at Howard University, and I am one of the hosts of this book club. I want also to introduce the other co-hosts who are here, and I am not sure if their videos are on at this point. Then first, let's see Alex Gil, and who is from Columbia University and who is a digital scholar, and who is also then convening with us this second session, and you'll be with us for the rest of the year. And who knows if this initiative continues after that, he'll be with us for the rest of this project. And then we have also Vanessa Holden, who is a historian, and she is, let's see, where is Vanessa? If I can spotlight her. Yes, she's here. Okay, then sorry everyone, because sometimes you are still trying to play with all the videos and so on. Vanessa Holden is a historian, and she is an assistant professor at University of Kentucky. And she has been with me and Jessica in some of these digital adventures before. Then she's joining us as a co-host of the Slavery Archive Book Club, and she'll be here with us for the rest of the sessions as well. And Vanessa has a book that is coming out next year. Then she will be one of the next victims of who will be presenting her work with us. Finally, let me just find where is Jessica here to spotlight the video. And our star today is Jessica Marie Johnson. And I've been following, of course, the work of Jessica since she was a graduate student. And it's then I am really happy to be able to host with Vanessa and Alex this session today, because this is Jessica's first book. Then it's her first monograph, titled then Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World. Jessica is a historian, and Jessica is an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University in the Department of History. This session, as far as I can see now, we have almost 80 people. I will not be longer with this introduction. I invite you to see the entire program of the book club on our website, that is slaveryarchive.wordpress.com. And you are going to have about one session every month. And sometimes you are going to have twice a month. Then you are all invited to see the next sessions to get the books, and already to register for the Zoom meetings, because you just have place for 100 people. But then you can also watch on YouTube if you are not able to get in on Zoom. Now I will leave then Jessica present the book. Then she has about 10 to 15 minutes. And after that, you are all invited to ask questions. To do so, you just have to go at the bottom of the screen and raise your hand if you are on Zoom. If you are on YouTube, you just leave your questions on the chat. if you are tweeting about this session, use the hashtag Wicked Flash. And I wish you a good session. And if you can mute yourself, it would be great, because like this, we don't hear you.
Okay, so thank you, Anna, for the introduction. Thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited to be able to have a conversation about this book that I hope is going to do some good work in the world. So Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World began, can everybody hear me okay? On a wave or something, make sure that I'm, okay, great. So Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World began, I feel like, more years ago than I want to count. But it began with visits to New Orleans and learning about New Orleans and New Orleans history. One of the things that if you start digging into either the archive that is the Gulf Coast or the historiography that is about the Gulf Coast, Louisiana, or New Orleans as a city, many things will stick out to you. That the Gulf Coast went through multiple empires, which is not necessarily exceptional, but each left its distinctive mark on the coast itself and also on the city. That there are particular concentrated streams of slave trades to the Gulf Coast that lead to particular kinds of African diasporic flows and cultural formations in that region and in the city itself. You'll also discover that. You'll discover a whole range of political, social, cultural institutions that are created at the intersection of all of these. You will hear familiar things like, well, those who do New Orleans or of New Orleans hear familiar things like it's the northernmost point of the Caribbean. It's the southernmost point of the United States. It's the most racist place. It's the most, integrated place. So New Orleans, the Gulf Coast, but New Orleans for my purposes, it becomes this place that embodies many contradictions and at the same time refracts a lot of the different kind of legacies of American history, African diaspora history, archipelagic history, Caribbean history. So many different stories can be told about this region and about the city. And the story that the thread that ran through all of these is the story of the ways that African women and women of African descent made home, made security, made a kind of sociality for themselves, made what we don't always call freedom, but was a kind of freedom in this region and in the city. And so what I wanted to do was try and find just one story of that story, one thread of that story. And the thread of that story that Wicked Flesh tells is the story of the ties between New Orleans and Senegal's coast, the ties between New Orleans and different parts of the Caribbean, and the ways that particular diasporic and archipelagic flows of women of African descent, African women, come together, converge, diverge, and end up in this place that we call today New Orleans, and helped create essentially the dynamic social, political, cultural, free institutions, the deeply Black, the deeply African diasporic institutions that we see today. And so the book is structured to try and highlight that. So it begins, the introduction, if you notice, the epigraph is poet Ray Paris's, a life one of poet Ray Paris's poems, Be the Woman in the Water. And so what I try and do is use the water as, one of our original highways and railroads as a way of following what these flows look like and what these flows look like for this particular story. So it using water, which anybody who does New Orleans or lives in New Orleans or has visited New Orleans knows that water is a kind of ever-present feature. It's right under, the water table is high, so it's right under the soil. The river is right there. The lake is on the other side. So water is an apt theme, I think, for thinking about Black women's lives and flows. And so using water as a motif to try and bring many different histories together and many different convergences together. I moved from coastal Senegal and the story of free African women, enslaved African women in the port towns of Saint-Louis and their experiences interacting with first the Portuguese, which I don't cover. I start the story with the French, but sort of just kind of give the context of the Portuguese and the Dutch. Move through the French, and then move across the Atlantic with the slave trade between Senegal and Louisiana. That movement across the Atlantic also moves through the Caribbean, through different parts of the Caribbean, and touches on the ways that the French Atlantic space of the Caribbean, particularly Saint-Domingue, though with some touch on Martinique and Guadeloupe, is also influencing both the kinds of reactions the French are having to trading and flows into African women's experiences, but also the kinds of experiences that the women themselves are having in the kind of spaces and non-space for making autonomy and safety that they're able to create. And then it sort of gets deeper into, by chapter 3 and 4, which are sort of overlapping in time and space, we get to get more deeply into what happens in New Orleans proper. So what happens as African women arrive in a place that is so unlike the space where they left, even for those who may have been enslaved along the coast. What happens with changing legal structures, what happens with interactions with indigenous nations like the Natchez, Chickasaw, Choctaw, what happens with the steadiness of the flow of that slave trade, which is a very kind of concentrated flow, and what are the ways that when that cuts off, what are the kinds of worlds that African women of African descent creates in the wake of sort of knowing that there is, like, this is now the new world, literally the new world that they are in, and this is the world they have to create. It moves through that, French period into the Spanish period and the change of institutions, and tries to take seriously the change of institutions and what impact that has on Black women's lives. And then it ends with just the first decade or so of the American era. And so what I try and end there, in part because it's quite a change of regime, but also in part because often stories of New Orleans, and particularly Black women's interactions in New Orleans, their use of intimacy and kinship, often sort of start with that antebellum moment. They start with the American period. They start with sort of an interaction, a fascination with all the different ways that these women are not this. Like, they're not, just Protestant. They're also Catholic. They're also all of the different African spiritual beliefs. They are not just designated as Black. They're also designated all these other kind of categories. And so there's a kind of way that the story of Black women in New Orleans often starts there and charts that as the story of freedom. And what I'm trying to say is that actually starts much, much earlier. And in this story, that earlier actually begins in Senegal. The last thing I'll say before we sort of open it up is that this is one story that I think can be told about, even if we just looked at Black women and their experiences of New Orleans and of the 18th century. And even if we just stayed with New Orleans, there's also a story to be told about the experience of women coming from Benin. There's a story to be told of women who are coming from Congo, Angola. There's a story to be told of the interactions between the Caribbean and New Orleans archipelago. Apologies. So I think that there are so many stories to be told. I hope that this one begins a longer conversation about what is happening in the Gulf Coast past and the impact that that has for the broader Atlantic world and how we conceive of a broader Atlantic world.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Jessica. And now if you have questions, then just raise your hands. If you have comments as well, then feel free to go ahead. Those of you on YouTube as well, then just ask your questions, and you are trying to collect. Then once again, for those who are arriving now, this is the book that you are discussing today, because before I didn't have the video. And let's go with the questions. Erin Chapman has a question that, let me just put her. Okay, go ahead, Erin.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm really excited to buy the book. I've read the introduction earlier this afternoon, and I'll be teaching it in my graduate seminar this fall. So you'll have at least 10 purchasers of the book. And I'm glad to see you again. You might remember we met in Austin in March before everything shut down for the pandemic. So I'm interested to know, as you were crafting this book and following in the footsteps of historians like Jennifer Morgan and others who have sort of used the archive against itself, we might say, like Tara Hunter did in another era of Black women's history. Did you encounter resistance from historians who are more traditional in their approach to the archive? Were you encouraged to use the sources more literally, I guess, maybe the right term? How did you counter those kinds of remarks that this isn't history, or that you're creating fiction, or that you're, I imagine that you got these kinds of responses. I don't know exactly, but I imagine, considering the kinds of responses that I got in trying to do a somewhat different thing, but similarly on the trail of finding Black people where they are in a limited archive. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question. Yes, so, and thank you for sort of shouting out these genealogies that we're so beholden to and that are so important. I absolutely do hope and have found myself to be humbled in doing work that is, I hope, in the tradition of Jennifer Morgan, of Tara Hunter, of Stephanie Camp. I remember first coming across Stephanie Camp's work as a first year graduate student and just being stunned by what she was able to do in thinking about runaways and truancy and Black womanhood and the rival geography, all of that. And come to find out, I found out as a grad student very quickly, not sources that just say, hi, I'm running a rival geography. And so there's something really amazing about the work that Black women historians, particularly of slavery, but I would say more broadly, have been able to do with an archive that is not forthcoming. And so in that sense, I have been able to, I think, be in that tradition and to benefit from the kind of road that these scholars have forged. I have, where there was skepticism, and I was lucky that I did not receive that much to my face. I have had amazing mentors who have been shields and protective of me and my process and the work, like my professional development and the work itself. And so I have been very, very, very lucky and blessed to be protected in that way. But where there is that kind of critique, and I still think that critique exists within the academy, of course, I've been able to then turn to these scholars and turn to that work and say, this is what has been done. Look at what they have done with this. This is the work that I'm trying to do. This is the methodology, the tradition, the language of history that I'm trying to speak. And that has been really important. I mean, it's shown me that they did it first, allowed me to then build on the space that they created. And so it cannot be said, I cannot speak highly enough about the kind of space that Black women historians are making, even now in the academy, and how hard that is. That said, I think there are ways that even in knowing that road had been forged, there were things that I think I needed to do with the book and with the archive and the sources and this narrative that were a struggle even in constructing it. So some of the first drafts of the book, particularly the transition, this is very different from the dissertation, but particularly in that transition from dissertation to book, was like really kind of surfacing Black women's voices and making that the center of the story. And that was an act of revision that was like, revision isn't even the word for it. It's like excavation, both of the work itself and also of my own ability to try and make their voices speak, and some unlearning of what should be a priority in the work that we do. So did I want to prioritize a like kind of empirical French Atlantic history of slavery, which are important? For this book, I did not. I had to decide. And I think there's something important about making that decision for all of us. Like, what are the decisions that we make, even as we approach the archive, even as we approach the narrative, that are decisions we have to make before we even sit down to write, or decisions that we make when we come back to revise. And the decision I made was that I really wanted Black women to be the center of this story. And the last thing I'll say is that I had an amazing press. Bob Lockhart is phenomenal, who at one point even reminded me, like, Black women are the center of this story. You know, why did you write this paragraph, or these 2 pages need to be shifted in that direction? And so when you have an editor and a press, Kathy Brown was absolutely behind the book, that is in favor of your dream for the work and of the women's voices, then it changes everything. So I think there's a lot of work that we still need to do in the academy, make sure that people are able to do the kinds of histories that are important and that speak to everyone. But I also mark myself very fortunate to be able to do this work in this particular moment, and know that it turned out, I'm sure there's things I could have done different, but it turned out, I think, as well as it could in the era in which it was created. So thank you for that question. It's a great question.
Okay, I think that we still have, oh, okay, let me see, I still have Erin. And then I think that she wants still to ask Erin. Do you want to continue to respond? Do you want to respond?
I didn't realize I still have my hand up.
Okay, okay, no problem. Then let me go to see the next one. That is Greg Beeman, and let me just have him. I don't know if he has the video on. Apparently not. Then just go ahead, Greg. Oh, you have the video. Then I want to spotlight your video, but I can't. Go ahead.
Hi, Professor Johnson, thank you very much. This is a wonderful book. I also want to ask about archives, specifically archives in New Orleans, and this concept of the null value. So this concept of the null value I have discovered through your work as this something beyond silence and erasure. And I want to ask specifically about the archives in New Orleans. Everyone is organized differently, has different sets of resources. The Notarial Archives is organized completely different than the archives you'll find at the public library or the State Museum. And so I just want to ask you how you tweak your approach towards this concept, depending on the archive, or if your approach focuses on intimacy, kinship, and other freedom practices that carry across archives. If you could just speak a little bit about strategies you may employ in thinking about null values in specific archives in New Orleans.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. This is a great question. And I can tell that this is somebody who loves Louisiana the way that I do. So,
I hope to write a dissertation on one day.
Yes, absolutely. So I'll try and be as constructive as possible, since I know that you and others, I hope, are working on work in Louisiana. So the concept of the null value is a concept that I'm hoping that I posited as a way to think about, yes, that space between silence and erasure. It is a way to kind of think about the ways that things are fundamentally missing from our archives of slavery, across slavery. Slaveryarchive. And how then do we grapple with that? Jennifer Morgan has a fantastic talk that she gave on an essay that it became a part of Small X, I believe, on part of Sequitur Ventrum, about the ways that she sort of lays out, like, you know, like there's only so much archive. When it comes to slavery, there's only so much archive. And in fact, when it comes to Louisiana, a lot of it is disappearing because of the kinds of conditions of archival material. And we're thinking of like small parish archives in particular. And so we have to work with what we have. And that doesn't mean then that we walk away from it. It means that we grapple with the archive and what's there. And so I think there's, so she posits disruption poetics. Marisa Fuentes' work has been really important to me in thinking about reading along the bias grain. No value, I'm hoping will be a way to kind of think about what do we do with these empty spaces? And I want to thank Jacob Gabori, Mimi Onugua, Amanda Phillips, and others who are in digital humanities who are thinking about the ways that the null can be a useful framing, not just sort of an empty or unaccountable or misunderstood factor in our digital architecture. For me, the null, I think, can function as a way to think about, to hold the space of the empty register, of the empty field in the census register, for example. What are the ways that instead of just not counting that or counting that as zero, that we actually try and think about and bracket what is around that space and try and see, okay, what does it mean that there are only so many Africans who are counted in the census year, and yet we know that, you know, however many 100 came on this many ships into this city and into this region. What is it? What do we need to understand about the disparity in knowledge that we have there, and not sort of cleave to the census register? So that's how I'm trying to think about the null value and offer that as a possibility. And that means that for a place like Louisiana, and thinking about those archives, and Greg, you're exactly right, is that New Orleans is rich in archives and archival material, and deliciously messy in the ways that that material is organized, in part because it is organized across 3 different empires, in part because it's organized in different institutions in different ways, and it's organized both contemporarily in like the actual organization of like the Noratoria archives, for instance, and also in that moment. So even the censuses that we have are written for different purposes and with different sort of like professionalization. And so they're not always meant to count everybody. They're meant to do particular kinds of property counting, or they're just meant to count all the streets, et cetera, et cetera. So when I was crafting material narratives, particularly around the women in Wicked Flesh, what I had to do was essentially create my own archive of compilations of these different material that I found across different archives. So Maribod is an example. Maribod has been written about before by Gwen Hall. I believe Guillaume Aubert mentions her. I believe Jennifer Spear mentions her, and they mentioned her in a Louisiana context. It was, Guillaume, I want to thank Guillaume Aubert also for giving me a sort of like line on this collection in the archive. But it's only when you begin to sort of reorganize your own personal archive around, for me, around the women, that I began to be able to slot different material about each of them into a longer narrative. So I could combine the material about Maribod from her marriage document at Saint Louis, from the slave ship record of La Galatée, from the Superior Council documents for what happens with her when she arrives in Louisiana, et cetera, down, down, down. And we'll be able to kind of see those in its own kind of genealogy of her story. And so I actually have like on my computer a hard drive of different stories that follow different women, because following the making the archival document or the archive itself, the arbiter of the narrative, it was impossible to keep track of the women. I could find them, but actually following them in their story became extremely difficult. And so I think that that's one way that people can think about how to bring these materials together. It's extremely important for places like New Orleans. I would say everywhere, but places like New Orleans, Louisiana. I would say Saint Louis. I think Saint Louis and Gorée are actually shockingly, for those who are not aware of African history or African archival documentation, diasporic in ways. Like there are Africans enslaved and also mented labor for trading companies that are shipped to Guyana, that are shipped to Saint-Domingue for all kinds of reasons. So what are the ways that as we're building narratives, we organize our research material so that we're following the thread that we want to keep track of? And for me, I wanted to keep track of Black women. For somebody else, it might be keeping track of Indigenous women. It might be keeping track of the environment. But we do have to build our own archives and not rely on the archives as they're structured in and of themselves, because they won't be as forthcoming for all the stories that we need told. So thanks for that question.
Great. And now we have, we have a question from Mary Lillis. Then we have Alex in the line that probably will be bringing people questions from YouTube, and then Martha Jones. Then you can just wait, and you have, I think that Mary can go and just ask her question. I spotlight the video. Here we go.
Hi, well, this is a phenomenal first book. I mean, it's a phenomenal book, period. And so congratulations, it's really wonderful. I wanted, actually, ça tombe bien, as the French say, because I had a question about null value also. And you already started to answer some of my question about it, but I also wanted to ask you, in terms of the strategies for bringing the women's voices in, whether your sort of methodology of null value was mirrored in the kind of strategic choices you made as a writer. And let me give you an example. So as I was reading that chapter where you introduced the null value, I noticed that Suzanne, for instance, came in and out in a kind of fleeting way. And I thought, wow, this seems to be like mimicking the fact that she is here, but she's not there. And I didn't know whether that was just, was that intentional way of sort of reinforcing that concept of null value, in which case, wow, I'm really impressed, or whether that just is the way it kind of flowed for you. Either way, it's an impressive feat. And I just wondered if you could talk about the craft of bringing your methodology into your style, I suppose, of writing.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question. And now I would be foolish to say that no, the intent at all. So of course that was the intent. No, so yes, I think that one of the important things for me, and not just with Suzanne, but in general with thinking about how to tell a story that centered and held Black women at all points, in points where like you wouldn't normally find them, and at points where they wouldn't normally be speaking. It was important to me to write them in a particular way, and in ways that sometimes I feared were clunkier than they, than maybe a history should be. So being very, there's a note somewhere in the introduction about the language I use, whether it's African, women of African descent, and trying to be very specific when I'm using certain terms, whether it's something like that, whether it's, what are the ways that in spaces like with Suzanne, bringing her in as much as I can, which is not a lot because there's only so much documentation. The documentation about her truly is through Louis Congo's, narrative of being the executioner. And so in some ways, there is the struggle of bringing the women into the story at all. And Suzanne has a name. So in some ways, those women were actually easier than the hardest chapter to write, which was the slave trade chapter, or the slave trade section of chapter 3, which was, it was important to me to tell a story across the board where Black women are always, you can't not think about Black women, but it was hardest to do that with the slave trade documentation, and how to reverse that story so that enslaved women, captives, are there, and also not tell a story of triumph, or a story that disappears the violence of that passage, of la traversée. And so, in those kinds of moments of the book, I made choices like focusing only on the ships that, you know, had some documentation, thinking about, okay, where the ship does not have an actual register of, you know, women, children, men, women, and children, how else are they documenting gender? How are they imagining that they have to, you know, pinpoint and compute enslaved bodies as gendered figures? Well, when someone who is pregnant dies, they leave a little, you know, note in the margin, sometimes with a cross, sometimes not, if they're sanctified and if they know that they're Catholic in some way. In the exchange of slaves, when when slave ship captains are exchanging them between trading company directors, and they're often exchanging women. Same thing that happens in Louisiana when the Bienville and his cronies decide that they, you know, want to trade for the best of the batch of the cargo that are coming in. And I mean those words in the most crude way possibly, because that's how they're imagining it. They are looking for, you know, women and girls. So trying to capture both the calculations that slave owners, ship captains, officials are making on gender and race and gendered and the calculations that they're making to gender and race certain bodies, African people. That was a lot of work because the archive doesn't do that automatically. The archive gives you like numbers and you know, neg, negrion, rapaz, like it gives you broad terms and then that's it. And so, and yet it still gives you, for me, it gave me just enough, I think, to kind of twist it inside out. And that is some of that, yes, is very much, you know, when it appears, when there is no value to be spoken of, what value can you give? And what value can you give that also is attuned to the ways that there is gender and race actually in construction and process in this time period. And so all of that was a struggle to get worked out in the narrative, because I don't think that we are always, as historians, taught to do that. But it was really, really important that if the story was going to be told, that Black women had to be central at as many points as possible, and hopefully that happened. And I hope. Yeah.
Then now we have Alex. Let me just then, because he has a number of questions from YouTube. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, I have 2 questions from YouTube right now. One of them came after Martha Jones had already raised her hand, so I think we can probably go back to it later. Let me start with the first question. This one comes from Professor Chelsea Steele, who is the Associate Professor of French and Francophone Studies at Catholic University of America in DC. Now I have it right here. And Chelsea asks, sorry, I'm running 2 YouTube chats, long story. So congratulations, Dr. Johnson, on such an incredible book. A question of method and historiography. Reading through your citations, there is an incredible wealth of work from African historians, African feminists, scholars of African history working in Africa. From a Caribbean studies perspective, we've seen the importance of bridging, quote, North Atlantic work with Caribbean based scholars and historians. Can you speak about the importance of connecting with African scholars and historians? How did the connection with African-based scholars and historians shape your work?
That is a fantastic question. Thank you, Chelsea. This work doesn't exist without African history and historiography. And this became clear to me early on in thinking about New Orleans history and encountering the work of Gwen Melville Hall in particular. And then later through the work of folks like Hilary Jones, Ibrahim Achub, who I had the pleasure of participating in symposia in 2011 and in 2012. I'm getting those years like 2011 and 2013 maybe, both in Saint Louis, Senegal, and in New Orleans. This work doesn't exist without that work. And it is impossible to really appreciate and see the flows and the freedoms that women in New Orleans, Black women in New Orleans are creating without refracting it against both the world that they leave behind in Senegal, but in the continent more broadly, but also against the kinds of freedoms and the way that freedom is sort of operating and people are thinking about gender, race, space, taste, aesthetic, hospitality in a Senegal context. And so this required me to make sure that I had an understanding of Senegal's historiography, that I had an understanding of the work of James Sweet, but also of work along the coast. Vanessa Olivares, Lindsay Gish, also doing Senegal, was instrumental. Pernille Ibsen, people who are, Kristen Mann, people who are looking at an Atlantic Africa, Robin Law, who are also deeply invested and committed to African history and historiography. And so what that means is that from one of the key features of the Senegal chapters is work that is very much about coastal Senegal as its own entity, is not trying to think about, and I think this is important work to do also. In fact, Ibrahim Sek does this work for Louisiana and thinking about Pulaar and the Pulaar Nation and Pulaar cultural institutions, like the Poro and the Sande kinship societies, and how those come across the Atlantic and are manifested in things like the Mardi Gras Indians and food and culture and music. It was important for me to understand what is actually happening in Senegal, 18th century society, on its own terms. And so when doing that, what shifted for me in thinking about how that might apply to African women and women of African descent who cross the Atlantic and who experience only the American side of the Atlantic, not the Senegal side, is that it forces me to, and I hope others, to not just rethink their ideas and understandings of diaspora and diasporic flows or cultural retentions and all these terms that people talk about when they're talking about African diasporic history, creolization, et cetera. It actually forced me to rethink what an understanding of freedom is. If we don't begin from the point of our histories with enslaved people as enslaved, if we don't start with the slave ship, if we imagine that there is an idea of freedom that actually African women, men, and children have before they even embark on the ship, then what does that do and how does that change how we view resistance, how we view institutions that are created, whether within the enslaved community or beyond, how we view resistance practices when we are crossing the Atlantic and when we land on the other side of the Atlantic. So it forced me to not write a story where we go from slavery to freedom, which I think is a common story in the Atlantic and American historiography, but write a story about freedom, slavery, freedom, and that is, if that's the query, if that's the kind of tripartite story that has to be figured out, then that actually, for me, changed a lot of how I was understanding what women were doing. But all of that exists only because of Africanist historiography. And for African feminist work, it was very, very important for me to make sure that I was both clear about the ways African feminism differed from Black diasporic and feminisms that are emerging on the Atlantic side of the American side of the Atlantic, and also appreciated the ways that there are some synergies, maybe more than we imagine, that cross and crisscross the Atlantic world. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Now we have Martha Jones. Then let me just, okay, Martha, you can go.
Hi. Hi, my video is not on, or I can't turn my video on, but we're here, and actually I'm going to pass it over to Jean Ebrard, who has a question.
Thank you, Martha Jones.
That'd be nice.
I'm sorry, I have a question like Greg and Mary. I have a question on nullification. I like nullification. I think it's a very important part of the book. It's a very important historiographical term. If we want to speak of enslaved history and not of slavery history. You know, I think the moment is very, very important here, because you say, and that is, I think it's quite great. You say it's not to erase, it's not to make silence on in something different. So I have a comment and a question. My comment is perhaps you could look at in the way in which in linguistics, they are using a concept very important for them, which is degré zero, degree zero. What is the degree zero in a system of meaning is the values that everybody has. So, which does not make a difference. So looking at that in your archive, I was thinking that when you read the archives of New Orleans particularly, women are everywhere. They are not making difference because they are everywhere. And of course, they speak of Louis, the Congo, because that's different. But his campaign, no, she's there. It's normal. And so the way to read the archive with that in mind could be completely different. So where we see, oh, there is no women, we can say, no, they are everywhere. And we can track them one after the other. And my question is, what do you think about the way in which the first value that a woman constructs in the archives is just to have a name? When they have a name, it's different. And so there are no more négrillon or négresse. They are a name. And that changes all. And all your stories are absolutely marvelous because they are going from a name to another name and tracking just by that. So the question would be, why in the archives somebody has a name?
Yes. Thank you for that. Yes, I think that that is on track and on par with how I'm thinking about no value in particular. I love the evocation of women being everywhere. It's one of the things that I try to write into in the first chapters and thinking about the travel narratives and the ways that those center on, of course, like the particular people that someone like Bobo and Jejole are meeting. But like in that space, the empty space around those stories, there are women everywhere. They're doing service. They're making sure there's pleasurable spaces for these often men, but not only, traders and travelers. They're managing hospitality and the aesthetics of trade and diplomacy. And so when we begin to see them everywhere, yes, I agree. Like it does absolutely change the story. The thing with the null value that I think also maybe, maybe addressed by the Conference de France, but the thing about the null value is that the other thing I want to point to with null value is not just are they everywhere and let's see them, but also to query the question of why we don't see them, but also why they didn't see them. And to think about the construction of these documents and whether there's narratives, whether it's the census register as themselves contested and constituted by power in a way that the work of erasure isn't just a kind of forgetting or misplacing, that it's deliberate. And so instead of a kind of passive voice of, like they just weren't counted or they just were not talked about in this travel narrative as though, like that's just how the time was. I actually hope that the null value and that we as historians can challenge that and say, there's actually no reason why they should not have been spoken about, except that there was a reason. And in all of our archives and all of our narratives and historical moments, we actually need to figure that reason out. And so I think that that's, like that power piece and the power of the archive, which I know that you're interested in, as I am, is actually a very important part of the story. But I love, thank you also for picking up on the ways that names change. So it's already a lot of work for those of us who are in these archives to know, to find these names of enslaved people, of women, of children, of men, and to find them in the first place. What I wanted to, what's the best way to say this? What happens in the story of Wicked Flesh in the archive and in the narrative is that they do go from names, they're on the ship, names disappear for the most part, except Maribo. Well, even her name, we know her name because we know her from other documents, but in the slave ship archive, her name disappears. And then that name changes, but Corda becomes the wife on the other side of the Atlantic. I think there's something to what happens with the names. I think there actually is something that is not just about archive and power that's really fundamental there. One of the other reasons that the slave trade section and chapter was so hard to write is that archive is devastating. And anybody who does Middle Passage documents, and I want to think with, of course, like Stephanie Smallwood, Shawande Mustakim, those who are deep in the slave ship itself know how devastating that archive is. And there is something truly terrible about that missing name in that particular archive and what that does. Sure. And what that did to, and what I kept coming back to is like, what does that do to them? And in beginning, again, like with the story for me in Senegal, in the coastal Senegal, that does something fundamental to those who are on that ship, that there actually is something truly devastating and different about the experience of those of African descent on one side of the Atlantic, the other, who mark their experience through that Middle Passage. And I think that naming piece is actually something, and the no-nameness is actually something heavier than we've appreciated, those of us who do histories of slavery and diaspora. Not all of us, but I think there's ways that like we've sort of skimmed over that Middle Passage piece as a story that can't be told, so then we give it too much weight, or as a story that's like, you know, like this, it's just a story of numbers. And there's actually something important about sitting there and wrestling with, okay, what does it actually mean that we don't have names here? That we had names, we don't have names, and now we have names-ish, sort of again. And that's actually key to that change that happens in from Maribo, like speaking of Maribo to La Mulatresse to Madame Binet. There's something actually that namingness, I think, there's something fundamental there in that change and in that diasporic, that makes the diaspora essentially. And I don't think it needs to be a kind of like deep mourning and trauma type of fundamentalness, but there is a metaphysical dimension to diaspora and diasporic change that we don't appreciate in the Middle Passage. I think even something that we sort of, as historians, are like, it's about a name and a register. It's actually about so much more. So that's my sort of fumbling way of sort of trying to think with that. And the book, I hope, is much more eloquent in trying to explain some of these things. But that Middle Passageness, I think, is actually something I really wanted to sit with in the text. And then no-nameness and the namingness, I think, is actually really, really important there.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and then we have now Alex is still with some questions. Go ahead.
Hi. Yes, we have 3 questions from YouTube, but I see that Scott Heerman raised the hand and then just lowered it. So I'm going to go ahead one by one. Raised it again. Go ahead one by one from YouTube until we can get to Scott. So the first question is from Lisette Acosta Cornel, who is assistant professor at the Center for Ethnic Studies at Borough of Manhattan Community College, CUNY. And she asks, were you intimidated by the archives at any moment? The way the information is recorded, and or were you intimidated by the information itself, the stories, history, and the people living in them? Question about fear.
So this is a great question. Was I intimidated by the archives? No, although the archives are intimidating. I was not, I was excited. And galvanized by how much was in this particular archive. And I think of like New Orleans particular archive, the French, the Spanish, and then the American era. I was thrilled because what I wanted and what I have committed my work to be is to excavate Black life and stories from slavery's archive. And this archive happens to be forthcoming in ways that I don't know if other archives are. When I speak to those who are doing sort of Anglophone areas, my understanding is they are not. But in things like the notarial records, which I tried to get at in I think it's chapter 6, the chapter of Legacies of Freedom, these women they're speaking. And they are clear about what they want their legacies to be and to do and who they want to give it to and who their husbands were and who their partners were and who they live with. Like, it's so rich. And so I was excited about that. I was, I felt like and I feel like this for all of us who are entering that archive, that there are stories there that they want told. And there are stories there that are none of our business to tell, but that's another story. So I was not intimidated by the archive. I wasn't intimidated by the history or the stories themselves. I found them to be powerful puzzles that I needed to, with their guidance, with the women's guidance in the archive, figure out. What I am always intimidated by is the descendants and those who are in New Orleans now and Black women in New Orleans now. What I did not want to tell was a story, what I hope Wicked Flesh is not, is a story that is not a story that they recognize. I think often historians tell stories of places and certainly stories of New Orleans that are not the stories that that Black women see themselves in. They're romantic, or they're extra romantic, or they're extra violent, or they're this, or they're that, or it's a story only of freedom, or it's a story only of devastation. Like, there are all these ways that the complexity of Black women's lives, and even of those terms, Black and woman together as a dyad, get lost in the work of telling a history. And I was, and am always, and still intimidated by doing that right. That's really, really important to me. And so hopefully, Wicked Flesh is out now, so it is done right or it is not. But hopefully the biggest gift that I could get from this book and from this process is that Black women of New Orleans see themselves reflected in it. It's why I wanted the cover that we chose. Why I'm so grateful that Delita Martin was willing to use her art for that cover, because one of the biggest compliments that I received about the book is that somebody has shown it, a Black woman has shown it to her mother, and her mother is like, I love that cover, like as a visceral automatic reaction. That's the kind of stuff that I think I worry about. The archive, I think, is this fascinating, devastating, confusing place that I see as a puzzle that needs to get worked out. Black women I'm in love with. So I want to make sure that those I love and the city that I'm married to are always are satisfied and happy and see themselves and feel held by the work. So.
Thank you, Jessica. And the next question comes to us from Jamie Gemmell, who's a master's student at the University of Edinburgh. Could Dr. Johnson talk a little bit about the importance of water, bodies of water in her work or the archive? This is something which crops up throughout, from the opening of trade with the ebb and flow of the Senegal River to Pochenet's attack on Babé and Luison in the Mississippi River. So I just wanted to know a little bit more about this.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, water is a theme that I try to pull throughout the book. It is, I take from John Thornton's, I first read it in John Thornton, but I think other scholars have said it about the ways that, the ocean currents are the first highways, first roadways of the early modern era. And that's always been a kind of framing that really fascinated me, this idea of currents being the roads. And so what I wanted to do was bring that together, the roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, together with, what are the ways that African women and women of African descent experience those flows, and also experience the kind of the metaphysics of water as well. So one of the some of the ways that some of the most important intellectual formations, African diasporic intellectual formations, are around water, water spirits, water deities, and the work that water does, the work of hurricanes, the work of rivers. And I don't think that that's an accident. And so what I wanted to do is be attuned to the ways that being a pillar of African diasporic thought and intellectual understanding of the ordering of the world, how to bring that story of the water into the narrative itself. So in the chapters for Senegal, it's about the flow of the ocean, currents bringing ships to Saint Louis et Goé, but it is exactly that. It's about the flow of trade up and down the Senegal River, how important those trade flows are, but also like the marking of how those mark time in particular ways, the celebration that happens when the ships come back, the boats come back, the mourning that happens when boats leave, the emptiness, quote unquote emptiness, going back to Jean's question, of the islands, when actually they're full of women and children and those who are not part of the trading caravans, which tended to be heavily male, not entirely, but heavily male. So it goes, there's those kinds of flows. There are the flows of the currents that bring ships to Grenada, to Saint-Domingue, that bring, different characters around the archipelago. There's archipelago itself. Thinking about flows of water brought me to thinking not just diasporically, it's not just as like Africans thrust out and forced out, forcibly migrated across the Atlantic world away from the continent, but also the other kind of circulation that is slave trade scholars think about as a transshipment trade, but that is also a kind of political and social exchange of African diasporicness, African realities on the Atlantic side. And so there are also these currents that go from, that bring people from New Orleans to Havana, from New Orleans to Saint-Domingue, from New Orleans to Le Cay, that bring ships around these different places. There's the flows of the water that flood the river, perennially. There's the hurricane. So water becomes a very, very important theme, both because when you look at it, it just is so clearly there that it is difficult to ignore, but also because, I particularly wanted to center it because it is a pillar of African diasporic thought. And so if I go from and through Black theory, and recognize Black theory as marking something of relevance and interpretation, then the water and what happens with the waters becomes really, really important. And the last thing I'll say about that is that for New Orleans in particular, thinking about water, many of the histories or sort of studies New Orleans, geographic or not, will often start with the city being a particularly interesting geographic site. Water table, hurricanes, floods, the city that should not have been, the accidental city, all these different framings for New Orleans as a city. And I think that those, I did not start with that. So in some, in some ways, it does not follow that kind of traditional New Orleans as a city narrative. But centering that water piece allows us to also always think about that the environment, the ecology is actually always a character in our stories. It's always a historical subject also, and has its own sources that it can offer us to tell the story as well.
Let's see then, Alex, do you have one more question from YouTube, or do we go to Scott Herman?
We had 3 more questions from YouTube, so why don't we go ahead and listen to Scott's question, and then we'll go back to YouTube. First question by Sharon Lee.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I don't know if Scott, go ahead. You don't have video, I think.
Hi there, hello. Congratulations, Jessica. Thank you to everyone for organizing this event and all of the other great ones that I'm sure are coming. I've loved the discussion of null value in this, but I actually want to hear you talk about sort of multiplicity of values, which I think is another sort of theme in the book. It just came today because Trump is destroying the mail system. And so I haven't spent enough time with it for this to be fully formed yet. But there's a very conventional idea in the study of slavery and freedom that time and space are basic categories that give these things meaning. And as Martha Jones wrote so beautifully, jurisdiction as well in that great article, right? And so as a result, 1730 New Orleans is 1730 New Orleans and is part of French colonial history, or maybe US history at a later time, right? Relatively conventional, I think. But part of what you show is that 1730s New Orleans is also 1710 Senegal, depending on whenever this circulation began, right? It's going to be different based on when people disembarked. It's 1722 Martinique or 1729 Martinique, because those circulations are a bit more frequent, right? And as a result, the types of freedoms that these women are articulating and defending and elaborating, as you say so beautifully at the beginning, at that section from Senegal to New Orleans in the introduction, are conceived in Africa, are born out elsewhere, are elaborated and defended in yet another place. And so, in fact, maybe time and space limit us, right? Because they make us overstabilize the chronologies and the territories that these, in your case, women, but men and children in other books are engaging, right? And so can you talk about how you layer so many multiple different times and places at once? Because I feel like if I had to make those choices, like I'd have a heart attack constantly. And so how do you go about doing that? And do you think we've overstabilized time and place when we study even one city in 1 year?
Sure. This is a great question. And it picks up on one of the struggles. One of the things that a struggle is probably a strong word, but one of the things that did have to be worked out in thinking about this particular narrative and this history. I mean, so one of the things that I think is, flaw is the wrong word in the historiography, because I think it's just sort of the way things have unfolded structurally in thinking about how history is created. But one of the things that is always striking about the kind of New Orleans historiography is that it's sort of like there's the French historiographies, there's the Spanish historiography, and then there's like the antebellum American historiography. And some of that is because of the way the language training happens in graduate school. Some of that is because of the way, like, you get very familiar with one archive. And as Greg mentioned, there's a whole different kind of archive and a whole different organization when you go into a different empire, much less different buildings in the actual city of New Orleans. And so there are ways that I think that empirically and imperially, we have bracketed time and space into like these kind of discrete pockets that actually can be useful. It is actually very useful to get deep into French Louisiana and think about what is happening there, to get deep into French Saint-Domingue and think about what is happening there. French Senegal, where I basically leave the Senegal coast, is where the British essentially, a few decades later, the British come in, and it's a whole different Saint Louis story. So, there is something very important about sort of understanding these moments as bracketed by empire. But I think that there's ways that that's overdetermined. I think you're right in picking up sort of my concern that those things have sort of overdetermined particular stories and become the story as opposed to one of many stories. And so one of the themes of one of the underlying things that guided me in thinking about how to write the book and how to research it was Earl Lewis's concept of overlapping diasporas, which is situated for an African-American context, but is also about the ways that the experience, these histories actually layer onto each other. And so what are the ways that our work can be attuned to that? I'm sorry, I think that's Robin Kelly and Tiffany Patterson who do overlapping diasporas, or Lewis does to turn us on a pivot, excuse me. So what I tried to do were a few things. One is I made a decision, again, to really focus on the women, on African women and women of African descent. And if I followed them, particularly ones who end up in New Orleans. So I did two things at once. And if I followed them, the story would, as I try and say, sort of pick up. It would pick up like water, like streams. At certain points on the riverbank, you would get off, and then this is where you would be at. And then you might diverge in different ways on the water, different ways off the river, and then you might come back. And so it's a exercise in trusting the fluidity of the forces moving Black women, and also in Black women themselves. And in doing that, what I tried to do was sort of guide the reader by sort of naming it. So the diasporic and archipelagic as things that sort of interlock and also that diverge and also interlock, that come back together like different tributaries of a river coming back and forth. I try to give the reader those as a guide. So sometimes the flows of time and space are diasporic. They are about this arc of from initial capture to Barracoon to the slave ship to going across the Atlantic. And sometimes they're about these interactions between back and forth in this more, dialectic movement between the Gulf Coast and the Caribbean, between St. Louis and Gorée. That's also its own kind of flow, both in time and space. It's interesting because it's harder to do, it's easier to do in my head, as I'm sure we all experience when we're writing. It was a thing that was easier to do in my head than it was to do in prose, because I found myself grappling with historical conventions of narrative that had to be stretched and pushed to their limits in order to not to be chronological, but not so much so that you lose where women are going. And that was an interesting exercise. So I guess this is to say, like, for those who are interested in such things and who are as invested in sort of not allowing our Western conceptions of time and space to dictate the kind of stories we tell, I hope that we can do that more. And I hope that, sorry, storm over here. I hope that there are ways that, in doing that more, that it allows us to really center historical subjects that have not, that whose stories cannot be told necessarily in these kind of, what is it, Cartesian rhythms and whatnot. So, yeah. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
Okay, and I think, Alex, go ahead with the other questions from YouTube.
Yeah, before I get to the questions, Caritha Mitchell would like to say congratulations. I wanted to make sure that I got that in. Now let's move on to Sharon Lean, history at Michigan State, who asks, well, first of all, love this book. Second, question about the very interesting case in the final chapter between Maria Teresa and Perrine. The turn by Perrine to budding race science is so interesting and very early in that field. Was that the only evidence you found of those kinds of turns toward an imagined biological determinism?
So, thank you, Sharon. Yeah, so from what I understand, this is one of the earliest, a senior scholar told me that this was the earliest that they'd seen in this part of the Caribbean and the Gulf Coast of this kind of very explicit turn to a biological science. And I have not found things as explicit as this, where, you have, the progeny being determined, like the race of the progeny being determined in these kind of quantum calculations of race and hair and inspection and all of and bringing in surgeons. I haven't seen a case like this yet. It does not mean it does not exist. I actually hope that there are more, because I would love to see people do work, particularly in like a history of medicine, early modern science context around this. What I will say though, is that it told me interesting things about how to think about castas and how to think about the work that castas and race and blood quantums in particular do, and how that actually might be a provocative and important foundation and genealogy for how we think about biological racism in a later era. And so I hope that, I would love for someone, this is not work that I intend to embark on, at least not anytime soon, but I would love for somebody who's doing history of medicine work or history of science work or digital humanities work to think about the ways that castas and casta quantification of race essentially is also part of digital humanities genealogy, is also part of the history of science genealogy and the history of medicine genealogy, because I think that case is just a bare jump from that, from thinking about limpieza de sangre and from thinking about who you marry and the corporate categories of race that the Spanish brought to, that are more familiar in the Caribbean and in the Gulf Coast, but brought across the Atlantic world. And we have a lot to learn from that. So yeah, thank you.
Next question comes from VJ, who describes himself as a member of the public. He's an amateur a researcher who wishes he could speak French and Spanish, so he could do some work in these archives when he visits a new place. Do you have, he wanted to know, how well do you speak French? And I imagine this is a good opportunity to actually, maybe for other members of the public, some advice on how they could go about, doing some of this work?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's such a great question. So, one of the best places to start, I speak French and Spanish. My spoken French is embarrassingly bad. But I do speak it. I think that for members of the public who are interested in doing this kind of work, the first places to go are, so for the US context, the best places to go are to the archives and speak to archivists who can guide you in the work and who can help you find various things and who themselves are generally versed in multiple languages. And so if you know only English or you know only French or only Spanish, they can help guide you in where to go. There are some really excellent collections of materials that can be really, really useful. I'm thinking of Gwen Hall's database, of course. I'm thinking of if you go to Louisiana Historical Center, the WPA created a kind of intensive finding aid of the colonial documents called the Black Books. So you can also go check those out. And Louisiana colonial documents are actually also digitized late in the game for my text, which is fine because I met many trips to New Orleans at lacolonialdocs.org. So you can do that kind of work. Unfortunately, a lot of the material is not digitized. A lot of the material is not in English. A lot of the best material is really not in English. And so it is one of the things that I think has been a barrier to more intensive research, even for, not just for, like folks who are not in the academy, but even for people in the academy, like learning multiple languages and then learning, 18th century script is not easy. And it has only sort of recently as in the last 5 years or so, become cachet for Americanists to learn more than one language. And so I think that these are barriers that are real, and that as historians dive into the work in archives in France, archives in Senegal, elsewhere, that are part of our task is probably to do some very important translation and editing and publishing of edited collections of material. Scholarly editing is a important cultural form that I think that we can contribute to sharing this powerful archive in that form as well. So there's a lot of work to do, I think, for these kind of texts.
All right. Next question comes from Christy Thornton. She wanted to ask about the writing style. She says, I read the intro as an incantation, and I saw that word on Twitter already too a couple of times. The repetition of particular phrases, the rhythm of it, as a kind of speaking into being. Is that what you were going for?
Yes. What I wanted, I thank you for that. And thank you for seeing that. What I hope is clear in the writing and in the style of writing and in the narrative is a kind of invoking, I think, of the archive and of the narrative and of Black women in the narrative. And I hope a kind of accessibility that does not speak down to those who would read the text in the academy or otherwise, but that speaks to all of the ways that Black women experience the world. So I hope the text is sensory. I hope that it is invoking, and I hope that it is doing work beyond beyond narrative form. I can only hope that it's doing that. I did the best I could to make that happen, and I am full of flaws, and I'm sure it is not doing everything that I would hope it would do, that it was supposed to do. But if it is doing some of that, I will be very happy. So your question, I'm humbled by your question. So thank you very much for seeing that.
Next question comes from Renee Ader, Provost Visiting Professor at Brown. And Renee asks, can you talk about your use of Delita Martin's Night Travelers as the book jacket and its visual connection to your own intellectual work? How did you select this image?
So thank you. So Delita Martin's work, when I began looking for what I wanted the cover image to be, which I did in between procrastinating writing and in between the harder writing, I knew a few things. I knew that I wanted it to be a Black woman artist. I knew that I wanted to be a woman of the South, either in the South or born of the South, who trace their lineage through the South. And I knew that I wanted a image that captured the kind of flamboyance, the kind of insurgence of the women in the archive that I hoped were appearing in the text, and did that without reifying the usual stuff of the visual archive of slavery. So I did not want an image from, I didn't want an image from slavery's archive because I wanted a Black woman Black woman artist. But I also didn't want an image from slavery archive because I'd yet to ever come across an image that I felt captured the freedom, the kinds of freedoms that I was trying to show Black women engaged in. And because intimacy and kinship is so key, I also didn't want an image that was, that could in any way read as over-sexualizing, or that was not a sexuality or an embodiment that Black women themselves would not take up. So I didn't want any of the kind of images of a bared breast, or a kind of even the tignon to me felt like an image that sometimes is used really well and sometimes is overused and misused. when it comes to Black women of this region and of this era. And I did not, the same thing for the Seigneur Mouchoir de Tête. I didn't want an image that had carried the kind of colonial violence that some of these images just do. And I came across Night Travelers, which is the image that became the cover. And as soon as I saw it, I knew, and I prayed that Miss Martin would let me use it. I knew it was the image that needed it. Between the woman, there's women of different figures on there. There's women and girls. So there's Black womanhood at different ages of life. There's the masked child in the canoe. It's a canoe, speaking of water and rhythms and flows. And there's the dark figure on the back, which is, and if you look at the actual image, it's the figure, the second to the left, who for me represented in the with her own mouchoir de tête, her own tignon, in some ways, all the colonial fantasies and all the refusal of those fantasies, because it's a kind of shadow figure, it's a figure in Black. And so it's an image that does so much amazing work, that is a haunting, that is a evoking of Black women across time and space, of the metaphysics of Black womanhood, and I just knew that it just did everything in an image that I wanted the text to do, and it was an image that I hoped and felt that Black women would see and not see a fantasy of themselves. They would see actually a mirror, in the most positive way. In the most held way. So Miss Martin, I like magic. I actually just not long after I was looking for the cover, like magic, Jess Solomon, who is an amazing artist and creator here in Baltimore, invited me to a artist talk with Miss Martin for Gallery Mertis, which is a Black woman-owned gallery here in Baltimore. And I was able to meet her, and we started a conversation. And through that, she gave me permission to use that cover. And I am so humbled that, and Delita Martin, if you are watching, thank you so much. The cover is magic. It's literal magic. The book would not be the same without it. So I'm always so grateful that she allowed me to use that cover for this text, because it's perfect.
Okay, great.
Sorry,
okay,
I just wanted, there was a little follow-up from Dr. Ader's a really good point about the colonial image. She really appreciates that you selected a Black woman artist and a Southerner. Excellent response. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we have one question then from Alicia Hall, and she's raising her hand on Zoom. Then go ahead, Alicia.
So I had a question about maroons, and I'm still in the process of reading. So excuse me if you do answer this later on in the book, but I was thinking about it in terms of the ways in which you discuss safety and security and how that becomes tied to manumission. And I'm wondering about the maroon and maroon community presence in New Orleans, and kind of how that also might figure into what these women might find, or where they might find security as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This is a great question. One of the things that I'm doing in my second project is diving a little bit more into maroons and marronage, of which there is quite a bit in and around the city. And it begins quite early. As soon as Africans land, they're trying to escape. So the swamps around the city become very conducive to marronage. They become spaces that the French are not interested in traversing, in part because of maroon presence, and in part because of indigenous presences, polities. And they also become, the cypress swamps in New Orleans also become these resources. So in the 1770s, 80s, and 90s, and I don't touch on this in my discussion of the Spanish era, which is focused more on testaments, as you're noting, testaments and manumission and wills. But that's also the era in which you have two things that happen. You have the reinvigoration of the slave trade from the continent to Louisiana by the Spanish. It's a little more truncated. It's like it starts and stops at different years. But it's a new flow, which means you have Africans directly from the continent and from other parts of the Caribbean who are arriving anew. And then you also have the increase of modernage to the point where the Spanish decide to try and destroy modernage communities in the cypress swamps. And one of the things in Maroon's favor is that because, and this is sort of a theme in some ways across the Gulf Coast history, to the extent that the French or the Spanish can, they talk a big talk about wanting to like control and order, but to the extent that they can sort of outsource labor, they will do it. And so the extent that they can outsource felling the cypress swamp to fugitive slaves, they do so. And so there is a significant Maroon community. One of the things that I think is worth interrogating, certainly, are the ways that the Maroon community is its own kind of safety and security, yes. For me, one of the things I am interested in, and I do this a little bit more with thinking about people like Suzanne, thinking about the kinds of dances and the spaces of freedom that are created on Sundays, that are created on feast days, on holidays, just even within the, the New Orleans proper itself. The presence of the Maroon presence itself is a kind of counterbalance on attempts at controlling Black populations in New Orleans. So although I do not in this text sort of go deeply into Marronage and the Maroon communities themselves, and I think that that's really, really important work that I hope other historians, perhaps yourself, take up, particularly for Lower Louisiana. It is critical that that population exists because it is constantly the transgressing of space and the ability of enslaved people to abscond and to travel and to be mobile and to operate in the region in ways that the French are unable to account for, is actually really critical to the kinds of freedom and the spaces of freedom that Black women are able to create or want to create or imagine creating. And so there are ways that for space and for the conditions of possibility of Black freedom to exist, that Maroon communities, that space of Marronage also has to exist. It is a thing that is, I hope, evoked in how it is always on someone like Suzanne's mind, that there's, that there's this kind of flooding of like the King's Plantation on certain days from people who are, don't belong there, essentially, according to the French. And it's also always on the French's mind. What I don't want to do is sort of, and what I hope that we do less of when we're studying slavery is sort of separate these as like different kinds of freedoms, and instead see them as interlocking knots in kind of a broader constellation of practices of freedom that all are related to each other, and all are in some relation to each other. Like I'm thinking of like Lisant, like actual relation. Like they all require each other in order to manifest a kind of existence for the Black women, men, and children in this region. So does it make sense? Great question.
Okay, we have a question now that is coming from Twitter, and Vanessa is going to read for us.
Sure. I'll just start by saying Twitter is mostly full of some excellent live tweets and plenty of compliments. So it should be a delight for you to read through later. This question comes from Dr. Stephanie Richmond. Can you tell us one story that you had to leave out of the book?
Oh man. One story that I had to leave out of the book. That's such a great question. I'm not sure that I have a single story that I had to leave out of the book per se. There are sections. There is one section that is that had to end up on the what is it, the cutting room floor of this book that I hope to take up in another space, and that is from the chapter on the long middle passage, chapter I would say, the one that moves us essentially across the Atlantic, was actually much longer. It was a lot longer. My editors will tell you I had to cut quite a bit, and it was longer because I spent a lot of time trying to grapple with, and it's also in some ways kind of goes back to the water question that Jamie I think asked. I spent a lot of time trying to grapple with Black and Indigenous in this region. Again, one of the things that I wanted to do was tell a Black feminist history of the founding of New Orleans. And that became complicated in grappling with what Louisiana, what we now call Louisiana, means for Africans who are arriving in what is native ground. So I'm taking that from Kathleen Duvall's thinking of native ground. Also thinking of Robbie Shethridge, the shatter zone. So how do we who are doing Black life and slavery, and it's never more important than in this moment, grapple with Black and Indigenous together? And how do I do that, centering Black women, but also being in tune to the ways that Native nations, Native polities, Native histories are also operating in this place? And so a lot of the work, around the Natchez, around Choctaw and Chickasaw, around Indigenous enslavement that was primarily female oriented, and some of the work that was also about even just kind of the history of the Natchez War, from like a Black woman's history of the Natchez War. It's like, what are the experiences of enslaved and the very few free women who are around in this moment of utter upheaval, of geopolitical, of diplomatic crisis, which the Natchez War was. Natchez revolt, essentially, against the French incursions. A lot of that ended up on the cutting room floor because it was just too much information. It bloated the chapter too much. And so that chapter, ended up being very, very focused on the Natchez revolt itself, and not a lot of the lead up that actually explains the ways that the French are this kind of small minority within native territory, and how similar that is to the Senegal context in which the French are this small minority within Wolof territory. And so at some point I would love to I'm gonna, pick that up, I think, and do more with what is happening with Black and Indigenous relations here, and what it means to be an enslaved African woman in this place where your race and gender and body have become commodified, and not just for the French, but also for Indigenous nations who are also engaging in an African slave trade. What does that mean for these women is what that chapter sort of became more of, as opposed to a kind of broader question about Black and Indigenous and what that interaction is. But I think those questions actually are still really, really important. And I think that I learned a lot in some ways later than I was able to use as much of it as I would have liked. But Tiffany Lugabo King's Black Shoals, about how to think about Black and Indigenous together, and as a shoal, without losing one or the other. But I think there's a lot of work there still to be done, particularly for early American historians.
Okay, let's see if you have any more questions. We still have 15 minutes. Then if anybody in the audience wants to ask a question, you can still pick one more at least. Otherwise, you have? Great.
We have one question coming in at the last minute on YouTube. So perfect. So this is from Red Clay Full Punks. I didn't get a chance to ask Red Clay her or his or their name. And the question is, what were some of her strategies for physically and metaphysically navigating the process of communing with these ancestors and these histories?
This is a good question. I will say this, that I think that historians the historians of slavery in particular, I think, do not take as seriously as they could the kinds of writing and research rituals that we do. And so it becomes, and we don't talk about them enough either. And I think some of that is there's a kind of like, be objective, scientific, analytical thing that happens when we're supposed to be writing our histories, writing anything. And I am skeptical of that. And I am skeptical of the ways that, we are encouraged not to be close to our work, and discouraged from feeling our work. I think of again, Marisa Fuentes is absolutely a guide for me on this. Sasha Turner and her work on maternal grief. Joanne Mustakim in her, I believe it was her introduction or conclusion, talked about the ways that, speaking with the ghosts of the enslaved trade archive that she was working in became really critical to being able to write in the ways that she did and write history that she did. And so I think that we should all have ways of appreciating our historical subjects, not as numbers in, a database. And I have plenty of databases on my computer, so I'm a fan of databases. But these women are not numbers in a database. And so how do we actually pull that out? How do we actually connect? For me, at different points that meant different things. One of the things that was important to me is having a kind of steady writing ritual, writing on a regular basis, and having a way that I open the writing session. So that, might mean candles, that might mean incense, actually incense burning right now. That might mean flowers. It can mean many different things. For others, that means a walk around the block. It may mean, some others, it means like prayer. And so I think that, figuring out what ritual it is that you have is really important to steadying yourself in the writing and figuring out what exactly it is you are here to do. And I think it looks different for everybody. And I also think that we as historians who are working, those of us who are working in the academy, need to do a better job of helping, mentoring in and through these practices as well. But there's a whole range of practices that people need to have in order to engage the work. Yeah, I'll leave there.
Okay, folks, you are going to conclude now. And first of all, then we want to say thank you to Jessica for this wonderful book. If you didn't get the book yet, go ahead and get it. The book is still, we still have a code on Twitter for, you can get a 40% discount if you ordered the book at Penn Press. And I want to say thank you in particular to Alex Jill, who joined us today as a co-host and is going to be with us here. And also to Vanessa Holden, who is also member of the crew now. And of course, to our dear Jessica, we are wishing her success. And of course, this is a book club, but it's also for us an opportunity to celebrate this beautiful book. But before you leave, I just want to call your attention that we have a website with the entire program, slaveryarchive.wordpress.com. And we have the entire program then for the rest of the year. Our next session is on September 16 with the book Blood in the River, A Chronicle of Mutiny and Freedom on the Wild Coast by Marielene Kars. Then you can go on each of these meetings and already register. And also, of course, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel that by now I think that we are just putting there these live YouTube lives that you are doing. Then this session is going to be on YouTube. This session is going to be on YouTube in about a few minutes. Then once we end the session, those of you who are not able to attend today, you can watch it on YouTube, and also can be a tool perhaps for your students if you are teaching online this semester. And now as you have the entire schedule, you can also perhaps invite your students to watch the sessions. Otherwise, again, thank you so much for joining us, and hope to see you again in September. Thank you.